The Colorado sky hung low and gray that Tuesday evening, threatening snow that meteorologists had been predicting all week. Officer Richardson sat in his patrol car on Route 25, just 15 miles outside Denver, watching the traffic flow with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent 23 years reading the road like a book. His Belgian partner, Dutch, rested in the climate-controlled compartment behind him, occasionally shifting his weight and letting out small, contented sighs. It was 5:47 p.m., and was thinking about his daughter's soccer game that he'd promised to attend. He'd make it if nothing major happened in the next 13 minutes. Then he saw it. The blue sedan appeared in his peripheral vision, weaving slightly between lanes. Not aggressively, not the kind of dangerous driving that suggested intoxication or recklessness. Instead, it was the hesitant, uncertain weaving of someone distracted, someone whose mind was elsewhere entirely. Instincts, honed by more than 2 decades of law enforcement experience, immediately perked up. He'd learned long ago that the most interesting cases rarely announced themselves with dramatic crashes or obvious violations. They whispered, they hinted, and if you were paying attention, you could hear them. The sedan drifted across the center line for just a moment, then corrected. Watched for another half-mile, tracking the vehicle's pattern. Drift, correct, drift, correct. Not the pattern of someone under the influence, it was something else entirely, something more deliberate, more anxious. The broken taillight gave him the legal justification he needed. Activated his lights, the familiar red and blue strobes reflecting off the gray sky and the wet asphalt. In the back, Dutch's head immediately rose, ears alert. The dog understood the rhythm of work, and after 5 years as a K-9 unit member, he knew what those lights meant. The sedan slowed gradually, then pulled onto the shoulder, spoke into his radio, announcing his location and the vehicle's license plate to dispatch. It was procedure, the kind of routine that had become second nature, performed thousands of times over 2 decades. He pulled up behind the blue sedan, keeping appropriate distance, and stepped out into the cool evening air. As approached the vehicle, he could see the driver through the rear window. A woman, early 50s, with dark hair shot through with silver. Her hands gripped the steering wheel at 10 and 2 o'clock positions, so tightly that he could see the tension from 10 feet away. Her shoulders were hunched forward, creating a posture of extreme defensiveness. She didn't turn to watch him in her mirror. Instead, her eyes remained fixed forward on the road ahead, as if she could will the moment away through sheer concentration. Had learned to read people the way most men read newspapers. It was a skill developed through thousands of interactions, thousands of moments where the difference between calm observation and missed details could mean the difference between everyone going home safely or someone not going home at all. This woman was scared. Terrified, actually, though she was clearly trying to hide it. He approached the driver's side window, hand resting casually near his duty belt, and motioned for her to lower the glass. She immediately, perhaps too immediately, as if she'd been expecting this moment. Her window descended with a soft mechanical hum. "Good evening, ma'am," said, keeping his tone professional but warm. He'd learned that a little kindness in these moments often yielded better results than intimidation. "I'm Officer Richardson. I noticed your taillight is out. Can I see your license and registration, please?" The woman's hands moved toward the glove compartment, but her movements were jerky, uncoordinated, as though her body wasn't quite connected to her conscious mind. She fumbled with the registration papers, nearly dropping them. Her license, when she finally retrieved it from her wallet, trembled slightly in her fingers. Sarah, the license read, age 52, address in Cheyenne, Wyoming. No outstanding warrants. Ran these checks mentally as he absorbed the information. Her eyes, when she finally glanced up at him, were red-rimmed as if she'd been crying recently or was on the verge of tears. There was something else in those eyes, too, something had learned to recognize over the years. Desperation, carrying something unbearable. "Ms., where are you headed this evening?" asked, keeping his questions open-ended, observational. Most people revealed themselves through their answers if you listened carefully enough. North, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. North, repeated, keeping his tone neutral. That's quite a drive. Do you have family up that way? I needed to get away for a bit, Sarah said, and her eyes darted toward the mirror, checking the road behind her as if she expected to see something or someone pursuing her. I've got a few days off work. Thought I'd take a drive. The inconsistencies were already piling up. She'd said she needed to get away, but the tension in her shoulders didn't suggest someone taking a relaxing vacation. She kept checking her mirrors as if genuinely concerned about being followed. And there was something else, a quality of deception in her words, not malicious exactly, but desperate. The kind of lie someone tells when they're trying to protect something precious. In the back of the patrol car, Dutch sensed the shift in energy. The dog stood up, his powerful frame suddenly alert, his dark eyes focusing forward. Dutch had been trained to detect drugs, explosives, and contraband, but he'd also been trained something equally valuable, to sense when his handler's instincts shifted into high gear. The dog could feel his attention tightening, his body language changing from casual to cautious. "Is there something wrong, officer?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling slightly. There was hope in that question, desperate, fragile hope, as if she wanted him to say no, to just give her a ticket and let her drive away. But had been doing this too long to ignore his gut. Every instinct screamed that this woman was running from something, or towards something. And either way, there were layers here that needed careful peeling back. "I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle for a moment," Ms. said, keeping his tone calm but firm. "Just routine, nothing to worry about." Sarah's hands gripped the steering wheel even and saw her take a shaky breath. She nodded slowly and reached for the door handle. As she did, made a subtle gesture, and from the patrol car behind him, he heard the sound of dispatch crackling through his radio. He'd called for backup without saying a word, just a code that dispatch understood. Not an emergency, but backup requested. Something in this situation warranted caution. The evening had taken on a completely different character now. What had seemed like a simple traffic stop 15 minutes ago, what should have been a quick ticket that would have forgotten by the time he left the station, had transformed into something else entirely. The sky overhead was growing darker, the clouds pressing lower, and somewhere in the distance, could hear the faint wail of another patrol car approaching. Sarah sat in her vehicle with trembling hands, unaware that her life, and the lives of several others, were about to change forever. Sarah's hands trembled as she unbuckled her, the soft click echoing in the quiet interior of her car. She was acutely aware of Officer Richardson standing beside her door, his posture relaxed but alert, his eyes taking in every detail of her appearance and demeanor. She'd practiced this moment in her mind 1,000 times over the past 3 years, what she would say, how she would act, what she would do if someone in authority stopped her. But now that the moment had arrived, all of her careful preparation evaporated like morning dew under a harsh sun. She opened the door and stepped out onto the shoulder of Route 25. The evening air was cold, carrying with it the promise of the snow that had been forecast. Her breath came in small, visible clouds. Behind Officer Richardson, she could see his patrol car, and through the rear window she caught a glimpse of the dog, a large, muscular Belgian with alert, intelligent eyes. Her heart performed a strange, stuttering rhythm in her chest. She forced herself to look away. "Just stand here for a moment," Officer Richardson instructed, his voice calm but carrying the undeniable weight of authority. He turned his attention to her vehicle, shining his flashlight through the windows. "Is there anything in your vehicle I should know about? Any weapons, drugs, or anything illegal?" "No," Sarah said immediately, and this answer was entirely truthful. She had nothing illegal, nothing incriminating, nothing that would explain the terror coursing through her veins. "There's nothing like that." Nodded, but his expression remained thoughtful. He was studying her now with the kind of intense focus that made Sarah feel like an open book, every page of her life laid bare for his inspection. Can you tell me again where you're headed, Ms.? North, she repeated, but even as she said it, she knew how weak it sounded. I told you, I just needed some time away. North is a big direction, observed. He was standing close enough that she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the slight silver at his temples. This was a man who'd spent decades reading people, and Sarah had the sinking feeling that he was reading her like she was written in large print. North could mean Canada, could mean Montana, could mean up into the mountains. That's a pretty vague answer for someone taking a drive. Before Sarah could respond, she heard the sound of another vehicle pulling up behind her sedan. Through the darkness, she saw the red and blue lights activating, and another officer stepped out, a younger man with dark hair and a stern expression. Her stomach clenched. This was escalating. This was becoming more than a simple traffic stop. Evening, the second officer called out, approaching with an easy stride that contrasted sharply with Sarah's mounting panic. Hey, Dave, Officer Richardson replied. Just running a standard check. Vehicle has a broken taillight. Driver was making some unusual lane changes. I thought I'd get another set of eyes. Sarah's mind raced frantically. She'd done nothing wrong. She wasn't speeding excessively. She wasn't driving under the influence. But the anxiety that had been building in her chest for 3 years was now reaching a crescendo. She could feel it threatening to overwhelm her, to burst out of her in some kind of hysterical confession that would solve nothing and explain everything. Officer Dave walked around her vehicle slowly, his flashlight beam dancing across the blue paint. Taillights definitely out, he confirmed. Anything else? Driver seems nervous, said, and Sarah heard a note of genuine concern in his voice rather than suspicion. That somehow made it worse. Says she's from Wyoming, headed north for a few days. Couldn't give me specifics about her destination. Dave approached Sarah and extended his hand in a casual gesture. I'm Officer Dave. Can I see your vehicle registration and proof of insurance? Sarah handed him the documents, which were still in her trembling hands. As he took them, their fingers nearly touched, and she pulled back as if burned. Dave exchanged a meaningful glance with. Something had passed between them, a recognition of her extreme nervousness, a silent conversation about what it might mean. In the patrol car behind them, Dutch whined softly. The dog sensed the tension that had settled over the scene like a heavy blanket. Dogs were perceptive creatures, far more attuned to human emotion than most people realized. Dutch's keen intelligence picked up on the fear radiating from Sarah, the concern emanating from both officers, and the uncertainty that hung in the cold evening air. Ms. Officer said gently, I need to ask you some questions and I need you to answer them honestly. Can you do that? Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. How long have you worked at your current job? 8 years, Sarah said, grateful for a question she could answer without lying. I work in accounts receivable for an insurance company. And you're taking time off to drive north with no specific destination in mind. I just needed, Sarah's voice cracked. She paused, gathering herself. I needed to think about some things. Officer was running her information through his portable device, checking her license against various databases. Sarah watched his face carefully, looking for any sign of discovery, any indication that he'd found something concerning, but his expression remained professionally neutral. Your record is clean, Dave said, handing back her documents. No warrants, no outstanding citations, nothing unusual. Okay, said slowly, but I'm still concerned. You're extremely anxious, Ms. You keep looking back at the road behind us as if you're expecting someone to appear. Your answers to simple questions are vague and evasive. These are things that, in my experience, usually mean someone is either running from something or running toward something they shouldn't be running toward. Sarah's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. This was the moment she'd been dreading and secretly hopping for simultaneously. Someone in authority was asking the right questions, getting closer to the truth, but she wasn't ready. She wasn't ready to explain. wasn't ready to voice the thoughts that had consumed her for 3 years. "I'm not doing anything illegal," she said, and this statement was true, even if incomplete. "I believe you," said, and something in his tone suggested he actually did. "But I'm still going to need more information. For safety purposes, I need to know where you're actually going. I need to know what's really going on here." Dave placed a gentle hand on Sarah's elbow. "Why don't we sit in my car where it's warmer? We can talk about this." Sarah found herself being led toward the second patrol car. As she passed the first vehicle, she caught another glimpse of the dog through the rear window. The Belgian's eyes locked with hers for just a moment, and something in that contact made her breath catch. She saw intelligence there, awareness, a strange sense of connection that she couldn't quite explain. As she settled into the warm interior of Officer's patrol car, Sarah realized that her careful 3-year plan, driving north, following leads, investigating in isolation, was about to collide with official law enforcement in a way she hadn't anticipated. The truth that she'd been carrying alone, the burden that had become so heavy it threatened to crush her, was finally about to be shared with someone who might actually have the power to do something about it. The tension in her shoulders didn't ease. If anything, it intensified. Because now, sitting in the back of a patrol car on a cold Colorado evening, Sarah was about to cross a threshold from which there was no return. The interior of Officer's patrol car felt smaller than Sarah had expected. The smell of coffee, radio static, and something that might have been dog food mixed together in the confined space. Outside, the Colorado evening had grown darker, the clouds pressing lower with the promise of imminent snow. Sarah sat in the back seat, separated from the officers by the security screen that divided the vehicle into two distinct worlds, the official side and the criminal side. She wasn't a criminal, but sitting here anyway filled her with a desperate shame that she couldn't quite rationalize away. Officer turned in his seat to face her, his expression surprisingly gentle for someone who dealt daily with the worst of human nature. Officer Richardson stood outside the vehicle, his silhouette visible through the window, speaking quietly into his radio. Sarah couldn't hear what he was saying, but she imagined it was some version of suspicious vehicle, nervous driver, running background checks. How many times had she rehearsed this moment? How many times had she imagined being pulled over and questioned? And yet, now that it was happening, she felt utterly unprepared. "Ms. Officer began, his voice calm and measured, "I want you to know that you're not under arrest. You haven't done anything wrong as far as we can tell. But Officer Richardson and I have been doing this work for a long time, and we both sense that there's something more to this than a broken taillight. We're not trying to get you in trouble. We're trying to understand what's happening here." Sarah's hands clasped together in her lap, her fingers intertwining so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She'd been carrying this secret alone for so long, 3 years of isolation, 3 years of following thread after thread of hope, 3 years of dead ends and disappointment. The loneliness of it had become a physical thing, a weight that pressed down on her with every waking moment. And now, sitting in the back of a patrol car, she felt the possibility of sharing that burden for the first time since it had all begun. "If I tell you something," Sarah said slowly, her voice barely above a whisper, "something that might sound crazy, will you listen to me? Will you actually listen, or will you just think I'm delusional?" Officer leaned forward, his eyes showing genuine concern. "I've worked patrol in Denver for 15 years. I've heard a lot of things that sounded crazy at first. Most of the time, there's a kernel of truth in there somewhere. I'm willing to listen." The decision crystallized in that moment. Sarah had spent 3 years doing this alone, investigating, researching, following leads through the digital landscape and the physical world. She'd spent countless hours staring at photographs, comparing markings, studying details that probably meant nothing but that she'd clung to anyway. She'd become obsessed in a way that had cost her friendships, her relationship with her sister, and most of her social connections. Her had begun to notice her distraction, her tendency to disappear during lunch breaks to pursue her research, Her haggard appearance in the morning before coffee could mask the sleepless nights. Maybe it was time to let someone else help carry this burden. "My name is Sarah," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "But there's a lot you need to understand about who I am and what I've been dealing with." Officer nodded encouragingly. "Take your time." "3 years ago, my son disappeared," Sarah continued, and the words felt strange in her mouth, like speaking about something so painful that saying it aloud made it somehow more real. "His name was Michael. He was 16 years old. He disappeared from our home in Wyoming without a trace." Outside the car, Officer Richardson had finished his radio conversation and was walking back toward them. Through the window, Sarah could see him moving with purpose, as if he was about to ask more questions. But Officer held up a hand, signaling him to wait. Something in Sarah's voice had clearly conveyed the significance of this moment. "Michael was a good kid," Sarah said, and now the tears that had been threatening all evening began to flow. "He was on the debate team. He was considering college scholarships. He had his whole life ahead of him. And then one day he was just gone." The police investigated. They did everything they could, but after a few months the case went cold. He became just another missing person, just another statistic. Officer was making notes now, his professional demeanor fully engaged. "Have you been searching for him on your own?" "Yes," Sarah said. "For 3 years, I've followed every lead, investigated every possibility. I've spent thousands of dollars on private investigators. I've driven to every location, called every possible witness, checked every database I could access. Most people told me I was wasting my time. They said he was probably dead, that I should move on, accept the loss." She paused, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "But I couldn't accept it. A mother knows when something isn't finished. A mother feels it in her bones." Officer waited silently, letting her continue at her own pace. "About 2 years ago, I was scrolling through social media," Sarah said, "and I saw a post from a K-9 unit in Colorado. They were showing off their new police dog, a Belgian. And when I saw that photo, my entire world stopped. Because that dog looked exactly like Michael's dog." She paused, watching Officer's face for signs of skepticism, but she found only attentiveness. "Michael had a dog named Ajax. Beautiful animal, smart as they come. Michael got him when Ajax was a puppy and they were inseparable. The night Michael disappeared, Ajax disappeared too. I always thought that was significant, that maybe Michael had run away with the dog, that he was out there somewhere living a different life. But I never found any evidence of that. It was like both of them had simply vanished from existence." Officer leaned back in his seat, processing this information. "And you think this police dog is Michael's dog?" "I'm certain of it," Sarah said with absolute conviction. "There was a distinctive scar on Ajax's left ear. He'd gotten it during a play fight with another dog when he was young. The dog in that photograph had the exact same scar in the exact same location. The white markings on his chest were identical. The shape of his head, the way his ears stand, everything matched." "So you've been following this police dog?" Officer asked gently. "I've been trying to," Sarah said. "I reached out to the police department, tried to explain, but they thought I was just another concerned citizen making wild claims. Nobody took me seriously. So I started researching on my own. I learned which K-9 unit he was assigned to, which officer works with him. I was trying to figure out where the dog came from, how Michael's dog ended up as a police dog, and what that meant about what happened to Michael." Officer Richardson had returned to the car and opened the door. "Everything okay?" he asked Officer. Officer looked back at Sarah, then at, "She's got a theory about your dog, Dutch." Sarah's heart performed a strange flip. They were talking about Dutch, the dog she'd been trying to reach for the past 2 years, the dog that she was absolutely certain was her son's Ajax. "Ms. believes that Dutch might be her son's dog," Officer explained. "Her son disappeared 3 years ago from Wyoming, along with the dog." Officer Richardson's expression shifted. His skepticism gave way to something more thoughtful, more open. He looked back through the window toward his patrol car, where Dutch was visible in the rear compartment. "That's quite a claim," said slowly. "But I have to admit, it would explain some things about Dutch's background that have never quite added up." Sarah felt something shift in her chest, a spark of hope that she'd almost forgotten she was capable of feeling. "If I'm right," Sarah said quietly, "then finding out how my son's dog ended up working for the police department might lead me to my son. It might explain what happened to Michael. And that's why I've been driving north. That's why I'm so nervous. Because I'm this close to finally getting answers, and I'm terrified that it will all fall apart." The officers exchanged a long look. Something significant had changed in the tone of this encounter, from a routine traffic stop to something far more consequential. "I think," Officer Richardson said slowly, "that we need to have a longer conversation about this. And I think you need to meet Dutch properly, up close." Colorado Highway had become something of a spectacle by the time Officer Richardson led Sarah from the patrol car. The broken taillight that had started this entire chain of events seemed almost inconsequential now, a forgotten detail in a story that was rapidly becoming far more complex and consequential than anyone had anticipated. Two state police vehicles had pulled up in response to this quiet radio request, and their occupants stood nearby, curious about the unusual nature of the stop. A semi-truck rumbled past on the highway, its headlights briefly illuminating the gathering cluster of people and vehicles on the shoulder. Sarah's legs felt unsteady as she stepped out into the cold evening air. The temperature had dropped several degrees since she'd first been pulled over, and the threat of snow had intensified. The sky was now an almost oppressive gray-black, the clouds so low they seemed to press down on the world below. But Sarah barely noticed the weather. Her entire focus was concentrated on one thing and one thing only, the patrol car where Dutch was waiting. Officer Richardson moved with purposeful calm, his hand resting casually on his duty belt. Behind him, Sarah followed, feeling as though she were moving through a dream state where time had taken on a strange, elastic quality. Moments seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously. Her heart thundered in her chest so violently she was certain everyone around her could hear it. "Dutch is typically very well behaved in situations like this," was explaining as they approached the vehicle. "He's trained for law enforcement work, so he understands command structure and protocol. But he's also sensitive to emotional energy. He'll pick up on whatever you're feeling right now." Sarah nodded wordlessly. She understood what he was saying, but the words seemed to be coming from very far away, as if filtering through water. 3 years. 3 years of searching, investigating, following dead ends and false leads. 3 years of being told she was obsessing, that she needed to move on, that she was wasting her life chasing shadows. 3 years of loneliness and desperation, and now it had all led to this moment on a Colorado highway in the gathering darkness. Officer Richardson opened the rear compartment of his patrol car, and Dutch stepped out with the grace and confidence of an animal trained for his work. The Belgian was even more impressive in person than he appeared in photographs. His coat was a rich tan color with black markings, his muscular frame evident even under the thick fur. His eyes were intelligent and alert, scanning his surroundings with the awareness of an animal bred for protection and service. The other officers, sensing that something significant was about to happen, had moved closer. Officer stood about 10 feet away, his notepad still in hand. 2 state troopers flanked him, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and professional interest. Sarah was peripherally aware of them, but they seemed to exist in a different reality from the one she was currently inhabiting. Dutch's ears perked forward as he noticed Sarah. His nose twitched, processing the information contained in her scent. There was no aggression in his posture. Instead, there was a kind of calm recognition, as if the dog's trained mind was categorizing this new person as non-threatening but significant in some undefined way. "Go ahead," Officer Richardson said gently to Sarah. "Take your time." Sarah took a shaky breath. She'd imagined this moment so many times, rehearsed it in her mind during countless sleepless nights, envisioned it during her long drives across state lines, dreamed about it in the moments just before waking. But imagination could never capture the complexity of reality, the overwhelming nature of actually standing here, facing the possibility that 3 years of searching might finally be yielding real answers. She stepped forward slowly, each movement deliberate and measured. Dutch remained calm, his intelligent eyes tracking her movement. Sarah could see the distinctive scar on the dog's left ear, the same scar that Ajax had borne, the result of a puppy play fight that had happened when Michael was 14 years old. Her breath caught in her throat. The white markings on Dutch's chest were visible in the dim light cast by the patrol car's interior lighting. They formed the same pattern she remembered so clearly, a pattern she could have drawn from memory even after 3 years of separation. It was impossible. It was undeniable. It was everything she'd been searching for, crystallized into physical reality. Sarah extended her arm slowly, her hand trembling with emotions too complex and powerful to be contained in her body. She pointed directly at the dog, her arm stretched out toward the Belgian that stood before her. Around her, the officers and state troopers watched in complete silence, understanding that they were witnessing something profoundly significant, even if they didn't yet understand exactly what that significance meant. "That's him," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the distant traffic on the highway and the increasingly bitter wind. Then she said it again, louder this time, her voice cracking with 3 years of accumulated emotion, 3 years of grief and hope and desperation finally finding release. "That's him." The words hung in the cold evening air like a bell that had been struck, reverberating outward and changing the nature of reality itself. Officer Richardson's expression shifted from professional curiosity to something deeper, a recognition of the profound moment unfolding before him. Officer's pen stilled over his notepad. The state troopers exchanged glances laden with significance. Dutch, sensing the emotional intensity, took a single step toward Sarah, his tail wagging gently. It was a gesture that might have meant nothing or everything, a dog acknowledging a human who was clearly experiencing powerful emotions, or perhaps something more, a moment of recognition between an animal and someone from his past. "That's my son's dog," Sarah said, and now the tears flowed freely down her cheeks, cold and burning in the frigid evening air. "His name is Ajax. Michael's name was Michael. He disappeared 3 years ago and his dog disappeared with him. I've been searching for them for 3 years, and I found him. I finally found him." She sank to her knees on the shoulder of the highway, her body unable to sustain the emotional weight of this moment any longer. Officer Richardson immediately moved to her side, his hand on her shoulder, a gesture of support and acknowledgement rather than restraint. "We need to figure out how your son's dog ended up in the police department," said quietly. "Because I can promise you there are going to be answers to that question, and those answers might lead us to your son." Sarah looked up at Dutch through her tears, and in that moment the 3-year-long fog of uncertainty and desperation seemed to lift slightly. She didn't know what had happened to Michael. She didn't know whether he was alive or dead, whether he was safe or in danger, whether he'd run away or been taken. But she knew this. Her instincts had been right. Her obsessive searching had led somewhere real. And somewhere in the answers to how Ajax became Dutch, there might be answers to the most important question of her life. Behind her, Officer was already on his radio, requesting official documentation of Dutch's origins and previous ownership. The routine traffic stop that had begun with a broken taillight had transformed into something far more significant, the beginning of an investigation that would unravel 3 years of mystery and potentially unlock answers that had seemed forever lost. Officer Richardson helped Sarah to her feet, his hand steady and supportive beneath her elbow. Her legs felt like water, insubstantial and unreliable, but with his assistance, she managed to stand upright. Officer had moved closer now, his notepad ready, his expression one of intense professional focus. The state troopers had maintained their distance, understanding that this was evolving into something that required careful documentation and sensitive handling. Dutch remained calm, his dark eyes following Sarah's movements with the kind of intelligence that suggested he understood on some level that something important was happening. "Let's get you inside where it's warm," Officer Richardson suggested, gesturing toward his patrol car. "We need to document everything you remember, and you look like you could use a few minutes to collect yourself." Sarah nodded, though collecting herself felt like an impossible task. 3 years of compartmentalized emotion, grief, hope, determination, frustration, desperation, had suddenly been released from the locked box in her chest where she'd been keeping it contained. The dam had broken, and she wasn't sure how to function in the aftermath of that breaking. Officer opened the front passenger door of his patrol car, a gesture of respect, treating her as a witness rather than a suspect, and Sarah settled into the seat. The warmth of the vehicle's interior was almost overwhelming after the bitter cold outside. Got behind the wheel and started the engine, positioning the patrol car so that Dutch could remain in the rear compartment with visibility of the other law enforcement officers who were now photographing the scene and recording details. "Tell me about Michael," said gently, pulling a small notebook from the compartment beside the steering wheel. "And tell me about Ajax. I need to understand the timeline, the details, everything that led you to believe that Dutch is your son's dog." Sarah took a shaky breath, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her fingernails left small crescents in her palms. She'd told this story to police officers before, 3 years ago when Michael first disappeared. She'd told it to private investigators, to search and rescue volunteers, to anyone who would listen. But she'd never told it to someone who seemed to actually believe her, who seemed to take her seriously in a way that suggested they might be able to do something concrete with the information. "Michael was 16 years old when he disappeared," Sarah began, her voice steadier now that she was actually telling the story. "This was 3 years ago in July. He was a wonderful kid, Officer Richardson. Smart, kind, involved in his school. He was on the debate team, maintained a 3.8 GPA, was looking at colleges that offered scholarships. He had dreams of becoming a lawyer. He wanted to help people." Wrote this down, the scratch of pen on paper providing a grounding rhythm to her words. "We got Ajax, that's the dog, when Michael was about 12 years old. Michael had been asking for a dog for years, and my husband and I finally decided it was time. We got him from a breeder who specialized in Belgian. Michael trained him, worked with him, and they became absolutely inseparable. They did everything together." "What about your husband?" asked gently. "Where is he now?" Sarah's jaw tightened. "We separated 2 years ago. The stress of Michael's disappearance it was too much for us to bear together. We each handled the grief differently, and eventually, we just couldn't be in the same room without it feeling like everything was falling apart. It's one of many casualties of what happened to Michael." Nodded with understanding, not pushing further on that subject. "The night Michael disappeared was a Tuesday," Sarah continued, her voice taking on the hollow quality of a story told many times. "I was working late at the office. Michael was supposed to be home studying for his history final. My neighbor saw him in the afternoon, said he seemed fine, normal. But when I came home that night, he was gone. His bedroom window was open. Some of his clothes were missing, and Ajax was gone too." The police investigated, prompted. They did. Initially, they treated it as a missing person case with possible runaway implications. They searched the neighborhood, put out alerts, contacted his friends. But there were no credit card usage, no phone activity. It was as if Michael had simply ceased to exist. After about 3 months of intensive searching, the case was downgraded. After 6 months, it was essentially cold. By the time a year had passed, there were no active leads, no new information, just nothing. Sarah paused, gathering her thoughts, preparing for the part that would explain her obsessive 3-year search. "I couldn't accept that," she said quietly. Everyone told me I needed to move on, accept that he might be dead, but something inside me refused to accept that conclusion. A mother's intuition, maybe, or just a mother's refusal to surrender. I didn't know which, but I started researching on my own. I learned how to access police databases, legally, through public records. I studied missing persons cases across multiple states looking for patterns. I reached out to other parents of missing children, and I learned techniques for staying engaged in the search when official channels had closed. That must have been consuming, observed, not judgmentally, but with genuine understanding. It was, Sarah admitted. It consumed my life. My work suffered. My friendships suffered. I became the woman obsessed with her missing son, and after a while that became my entire identity. But I didn't know how else to be. How do you move on when part of your heart is missing? She paused, gathering herself for the crucial part of her story. 2 years ago, exactly 1 year after Michael disappeared, I was scrolling through social media late at night. I did a lot of that, looking at photos of missing persons, hoping someone, somewhere would have seen something. And I saw a post from a K-9 unit in Colorado. They were announcing the arrival of a new police dog, a Belgian named Dutch. The post included several photographs. Sarah's voice became more animated now, the memory taking on visceral reality. When I saw the first photograph, I stopped breathing. Literally. I think I held my breath for several seconds because I couldn't process what I was seeing. It was Ajax. I was absolutely certain. The distinctive scar on his left ear, the same scar from when he'd gotten into that play fight when he was a puppy. The white markings on his chest in that exact pattern. The way his ears stood. Even his posture, the way he held himself, was exactly like Ajax. "But you didn't contact the police immediately?" asked. "I did," Sarah said. "I called the Colorado Police Department, tried to explain. But think about how it sounds, Officer Richardson. A woman in Wyoming calling about a missing dog that might be connected to her missing son. It sounded like I was grasping at straws, desperate for any connection, any hope. They were polite, but they clearly thought I was delusional. They suggested that many dogs of the same breed can look similar, that I was probably just seeing what I wanted to see." "So you decided to investigate yourself," said, understanding dawning in his expression. "I spent the last 2 years tracking Dutch's movement through the police department, researching his background, trying to figure out where he came from, who had owned him before he was with the police. But the records were sparse, incomplete. There were gaps in his history that couldn't be explained. He appeared in the system about 5 years ago, but where he came from before that was murky. All I could find was that he'd been surrendered to a shelter in Wyoming, but even that information was vague." Sarah looked directly at Officer Richardson, her eyes intense with the certainty of someone who had spent 2 years pursuing a single lead. "And that's when I started driving north," she said. "I had a theory that if I could get close to Dutch, if I could see him in person, I could confirm my suspicion. And more importantly, if I could prove that Ajax and Dutch are the same dog, then it might lead us to understanding what happened to Michael. Because somehow, my son's dog ended up in a police department in Colorado, and that connection might be the key to everything." Was quiet for a long moment, processing the scope of Sarah's investigation, the dedication and obsession that had driven her forward for 2 years after being dismissed by official channels. "We'll need to investigate Dutch's background thoroughly," said finally. "We'll need to find out exactly who surrendered him to that shelter in Wyoming, because that person, whoever they are, might have information about what happened to Michael." In the rear compartment of the patrol car, Dutch rested his head on his paws, unaware that he was about to become the key piece of evidence in a cold case that had haunted a mother for 3 long years. Officer Richardson didn't file a standard report that night. Instead, he filed what law enforcement called a priority investigation request, a document that carried more weight than routine paperwork, and flagged the case for immediate attention across multiple jurisdictions. By midnight, as Sarah sat in a small motel room outside Denver, her hands wrapped around a lukewarm cup of coffee that Officer had purchased for her, The gears of official law enforcement investigation were beginning to turn with deliberate purpose. The next morning came gray and cold, snow finally beginning to fall in soft, lazy flakes that accumulated slowly on the windows of the motel room. Sarah hadn't slept. She'd spent the night staring at her laptop screen, pulling up photographs of Dutch from every available source: police department social media posts, news articles about K-9 unit achievements, training documentation that had been released to the public. Beside these images, she'd opened her old digital archives, files she'd created 3 years ago when Michael first disappeared. Photographs of Ajax as a puppy, as a young dog, in his full adult form. The resemblance was undeniable to her eye, but she understood the skepticism of law enforcement. Without concrete evidence, DNA testing, microchip verification, registered ownership documentation, it was difficult to prove conclusively that two dogs separated by 5 years and hundreds of miles were actually the same animal. Her phone rang at 7:43 a.m., and Officer Richardson's name appeared on the screen. "Ms.," he said without preamble, his voice carrying an undercurrent of excitement tempered by professional restraint. "I have some information for you. Can you meet me at police headquarters in Denver in about an hour?" Sarah's heart began to race. "What have you found?" "I don't want to say too much over the phone," replied, "but we've started investigating Dutch's background, and there are some very interesting inconsistencies that have come to light. Some things that don't quite add up. I think you need to see this in person." An hour later, Sarah found herself in a small conference room at the Denver Police Department, surrounded by filing boxes, computer printouts, and the kind of organized chaos that suggested serious investigative work was. Officer Richardson sat across from her, accompanied by a woman in her 40s with sharp, intelligent eyes and the bearing of someone accustomed to dealing with complex cases. She introduced herself as Detective Maria Santos, part of the department's cold cases and missing persons division. "We've been digging into Dutch's paperwork," Detective Santos began, opening a thick folder filled with documents. "And what we've found is troubling, to say the least. The official record states that Dutch was obtained from a reputable breeder in Nebraska named James. However, when we contacted Mr., he had no record of ever working with anyone from our police department. He'd never sold a dog to the person who ostensibly purchased Dutch." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "So that's false." "Not necessarily false in intent," Detective Santos explained, "but definitely inconsistent with reality. We then contacted the animal shelter in Wyoming where Dutch was supposedly evaluated before being brought into our K-9 program. The records there are even more problematic. According to the shelter's intake documentation, a man named Robert Finch surrendered the dog about 5 years ago. But here's where it gets interesting. Finch paid the shelter staff a substantial amount of money, $5,000, to skip the normal intake procedures and avoid creating detailed documentation. Officer Richardson leaned forward. "In law enforcement, when someone goes to that much trouble and expense to avoid documentation of an animal, it usually means they're trying to obscure the animal's origins. They don't want there to be a paper trail leading back to them." "Did you find Robert Finch?" Sarah asked, her hands gripping the edge of the table. Detective Santos exchanged a meaningful glance with Officer Richardson. "That's where this gets really interesting. Robert Finch was questioned in connection with 3 missing persons cases between 2019 and 2021, 2 cases in Wyoming, 1 in Colorado. He was never formally charged with anything, but he remained a person of interest in all 3 cases. The investigations ultimately went nowhere, but Finch's background shows a pattern of behavior that concerns us." "What kind of pattern?" Sarah's voice was barely audible. "Finch had a history of working with vulnerable populations," Detective Santos said carefully. "He volunteered with youth organizations, ran what appeared to be legitimate outreach programs for at-risk teenagers, but our investigators found no legitimate nonprofit registration, no tax documentation, no verifiable funding sources. It was all smoke and mirrors. He'd disappear for months at a time, then resurface in different states with different cover stories. Officer Richardson pulled out another document, this one a photograph of a man in his 50s with cold, calculating eyes and a thin smile. "This is Robert Finch. Do you recognize him?" Sarah studied the photograph carefully, searching her memory for any connection to this face, any recollection of whether Michael might have mentioned him. But the photograph stirred no recognition. She shook her head slowly. "That doesn't necessarily mean anything," Detective Santos said. "If Finch was involved in what we're beginning to suspect, he would have been careful about how he approached potential targets. He wouldn't introduce himself as his real self." "What are you beginning to suspect?" Sarah asked, though she was afraid she already knew the answer. "We're beginning to suspect that Robert Finch may have been involved in a human trafficking operation," Detective Santos said bluntly. "The pattern of missing teenagers, the false nonprofit fronts, the constant movement between states, the careful obscuring of identities and documentation, it all fits a very specific profile. And the fact that Finch went to such elaborate lengths to hide the origins of a dog suggests that the dog might have been connected to one of his activities. That dog might have belonged to someone he had contact with." Sarah's hands were shaking so badly she had to clasp them together. This was the moment she'd been simultaneously hopping for and dreading, the moment when her suspicions moved from personal obsession into official investigation, when her son's disappearance transformed from a cold case into a potential crime against a larger criminal enterprise. "We're reaching out to federal authorities," Officer Richardson explained. "The FBI has task forces dedicated to human trafficking, and Finch's activities span multiple state lines. If he was involved in trafficking operations, this becomes a federal matter. We're also going to push for comprehensive DNA testing of Dutch against any biological samples we might be able to obtain that belong to Michael." "Do you have biological samples?" Sarah asked urgently. "We're requesting Michael's medical records from his pediatrician," Detective Santos said. "Most pediatric offices retain blood samples for several years after annual checkups. If we can obtain those, we can run a genetic comparison with Dutch. It won't prove anything definitively, but it could provide corroborating evidence." Officer Richardson pulled out another file. "We're also reopening the original missing persons investigation into Michael. With this new information about Finch, we have a concrete lead to pursue. We're going to interview everyone who had contact with Michael in the months leading up to his disappearance. We're going to pull his school records, his social media accounts, everything we can access legally." "What about Michael?" Sarah asked, her voice breaking. "If this Finch person had something to do with Michael's disappearance, do you think Michael might still be alive?" The officers exchanged glances, and in that hesitation, Sarah understood the difficult reality of the situation. Detective Santos chose her words carefully. "We don't have enough information to make any determination about Michael's current status," she said. "But I can tell you that human trafficking victims sometimes survive for years in captivity. Some manage to escape. Some are recovered by law enforcement. It's not a hopeful reality, but it is a reality that we've seen before." "So there's still a chance," Sarah said. Not quite a question, but not quite a statement either. "There's always a chance," Officer Richardson said gently. "And now we have a direction to pursue, thanks to your persistence and your instincts about Dutch. We have a name, Robert Finch. We have federal resources that can help us investigate. Your son's disappearance is no longer a cold case being pursued by a desperate mother alone. It's now an active investigation with the resources of multiple law enforcement agencies." Over the next 72 hours, a comprehensive investigation into Robert Finch's background began. Federal agents pulled his financial records, his travel history, his communications with known associates. They discovered a network of criminal activity far more extensive than anyone had initially suspected. Finch had connections to individuals in 5 states, all of whom had connections to missing persons cases. The pattern was becoming clearer, more horrifying, and more actionable with each new piece of information that emerged from the darkest corners of the digital landscape and official records. Dutch, meanwhile, remained at the police department, unaware that he had become the most important witness in multiple active investigations. The federal building in Denver occupied a gleaming tower of glass and steel that seemed to touch the perpetually gray Colorado sky. Sarah sat in a waiting area on the 14th floor, her hands folded in her lap, her mind oscillating between hope and dread. It was now 6 days since the traffic stop that had changed everything. 6 days since she'd pointed at Dutch on the side of Route 25 and spoken those 2 words that had set an entire investigative machinery in motion. In that time, her life had transformed from isolated obsession to the center of a rapidly expanding federal investigation. Agent James Mitchell from the FBI's Human Trafficking Task Force emerged from a secure conference room, his expression grave and purposeful. He was a tall man in his late 50s, with the bearing of someone who'd spent decades confronting the darkest aspects of human nature. Behind him came Detective Maria Santos, Officer Richardson, and 3 other federal agents whose names Sarah had already begun to forget in her state of emotional and mental exhaustion. "Ms. Agent Mitchell said, gesturing for her to follow, "we need to show you something. We need your help identifying some details that might be significant to the investigation." The conference room was a stark space lined with whiteboards covered in photographs, names, dates, and red string connecting various pieces of information like a monstrous web of criminal activity. Sarah's breath caught as she took in the scope of what was displayed. At the center of the web was a photograph of Robert Finch, and radiating outward from his image were photographs of dozens of other individuals, some marked with question marks, others with red X's indicating they were now deceased or presumed dead. "What you're looking at," Agent Mitchell explained, pulling up a chair for Sarah, "is a criminal network that has been operating across 5 states for nearly a decade. We initially thought Finch was working independently, but as we've dug deeper, we've discovered he was part of something far larger and more organized." "A trafficking ring," Sarah said quietly. "Yes," Detective Santos confirmed. "Specifically, a network that targeted vulnerable teenagers and young adults. They would identify potential victims, runaways, foster children, teenagers from broken homes, and exploit their situations. Some were forced into labor. Others were sexually exploited. Still others were moved between locations constantly, making it nearly impossible for law enforcement or families to locate them." Sarah felt bile rise in her throat. The implications of what they were saying, the reality of what Michael might have experienced, threatened to overwhelm her capacity to process information. Agent Mitchell pulled up a digital file on the large monitor mounted on the wall. "We've been able to identify 17 confirmed victims connected to this network. 14 are accounted for, some have been recovered, some are deceased. 3 remain missing, and one of those 3 is potentially your son, Michael." Sarah's hands gripped the armrests of her chair so tightly that her fingernails left small marks in the fabric. "Here's what we believe happened," Agent Mitchell continued, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won professional knowledge. "Robert Finch identified Michael as a potential target approximately 4 years ago. Finch had connections to your area through his volunteer work with youth organizations. He likely made contact with Michael through one of these organizations or through social media. He would have built trust gradually, identified Michael's vulnerabilities, and then orchestrated his removal from your home." "The dog," Sarah said suddenly. "Ajax. Michael would have been more likely to go with someone if they offered to let him take the dog." "Exactly," Detective Santos said. "We believe Finch used the dog as leverage to ensure Michael's cooperation. Once Michael and the dog were in Finch's custody, They were moved to a holding location in Nebraska, which Finch used as a central processing point. That's where the dog was surrendered to the shelter with those payments to avoid documentation. The dog was then legitimately adopted and eventually sold to our police department. But Michael was moved again. Where? Sarah's voice was barely audible. We're still determining that, Agent Mitchell said. But we have evidence of trafficking operations in Colorado, Wyoming, and New Mexico. Michael was likely moved between multiple locations, similar to how the network operated with other victims. Sarah's mind reeled. 3 years. 3 years of not knowing, of searching in the dark, and the entire time her son had potentially been trapped in a nightmare that was almost beyond her capacity to comprehend. We've recovered communications, one of the other federal agents said, stepping forward with a tablet. Text messages, encrypted chats, financial records showing payments. We're building a timeline of the network's activities. We're cross-referencing everything with missing persons reports from the relevant states, and we're beginning to identify other individuals involved in the trafficking operation. A photograph appeared on the monitor, a woman in her 40s, hard-faced and calculating. This is Finch's primary associate. She handled logistics, arranging transportation, securing locations, managing documentation. We're also identifying individuals who purchased services from this network, people who directly profited from the exploitation of these teenagers. Sarah felt her stomach turn. The scope of the criminal enterprise was becoming increasingly horrifying. What about the people who ran the network? Sarah asked. The people at the top. That's where our investigation is leading us now, Agent Mitchell said. Finch and were mid-level operators. They took orders from someone higher up in the chain of command. We're analyzing financial records, communication patterns, and victim testimonies to identify the people at the top of this organization. But I can tell you this. Whoever is running this operation has significant resources, significant connections, and has been very careful about maintaining distance from the actual crimes. How many victims are we talking about? Sarah asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Across the 5-state region and the decade-plus we're examining, we're currently identifying somewhere between 70 and 100 potential victims, one of the other agents said quietly. Some of those individuals may have survived and moved on with their lives. Others may still be in captivity. And some, the agent trailed off, but the meaning was clear. Sarah put her head in her hands. 70 to 100 people. 70 to 100 teenagers and young adults who had been identified as vulnerable, targeted, and exploited. And her son, Michael, was potentially one of them. We need to ask you some difficult questions, Detective Santos said gently. Questions about Michael's life before his disappearance. Was he connected to any of Finch's organizations? Did he ever mention meeting any of the individuals we've identified? Did he seem troubled or anxious in the months before he disappeared? Sarah spent the next 4 hours answering questions, providing details about Michael's life, his friends, his school, his activities. She provided contact information for his friends, his teachers, his pediatrician. She gave permission for federal agents to access his school records, his social media accounts, everything that might provide clues to his final months before disappearance. As she answered each question, Detective Santos and Agent Mitchell were simultaneously conducting interviews across multiple states. Michael's high school friends were being questioned. Teachers were being contacted. Former volunteers from the youth organizations that Finch had infiltrated were being investigated for possible connections to the trafficking ring. By evening, the first significant breakthrough emerged. One of Michael's classmates, a boy named David Torres, remembered Michael mentioning a man named Robert, who worked with a youth mentorship program. David recalled that Michael had become withdrawn and anxious after connecting with Robert, that Michael had talked about a new opportunity that would take him out of state. Michael had asked David not to mention it to anyone, saying it was a surprise. That detail, combined with cell phone records showing Michael's phone pinging towers along the route toward Nebraska on the night of his disappearance, provided critical corroboration of the investigators' theory. "We're going to get warrants for Finch's residences and storage facilities," Agent Mitchell told Sarah. "We're going to push for federal charges related to trafficking, conspiracy, and kidnapping. We're going to pursue this investigation with every resource we have." "And Michael," Sarah asked, "what happens to Michael?" "We're going to find out what happened to your son," Agent Mitchell said, and in his eyes, Sarah saw the same determination that had driven her own search for 3 years. "That's our priority now, and if Michael is still alive somewhere, we're going to bring him home." As Sarah left the federal building that evening, her phone buzzed with a text from Officer Richardson. "DNA results back on Dutch. We need to talk." Officer Richardson's office was small and cluttered, filled with photographs of police dogs past and present, commendations from the department, and personal mementos from 23 years of law enforcement service. Sarah sat across from him, her hands trembling as she waited for him to explain the DNA results. Next to sat Detective Santos, whose expression was carefully neutral in a way that suggested she was bracing for difficult emotions. "The DNA came back positive," Officer Richardson said gently. "Dutch is Ajax. There's no doubt whatsoever. The genetic markers are unambiguous. Your son's dog is working as a police officer in our department." Sarah should have felt triumph at this confirmation. After 3 years of searching, after 2 years of obsessive investigation following the initial dismissal by authorities, she finally had concrete proof. But instead, she felt only a hollow ache, because the confirmation of Dutch's identity came with an unspoken corollary. If the dog was alive and had been surrendered by Robert Finch 5 years ago, then Michael had been in Finch's custody for an entire year before the dog was abandoned at the shelter. "What about Michael?" Sarah asked quietly. "What have you found?" Detective Santos exchanged a glance with Officer Richardson, a silent communication between two professionals who'd spent their careers delivering devastating news to families. "We've recovered remains," Detective Santos said carefully, "in a storage facility in Albuquerque, New Mexico, registered under a false name but with financial connections to Robert Finch. We've preliminarily identified them as Michael based on dental records and personal effects found in the facility. We're conducting full forensic analysis, but we're fairly certain." The words seemed to come from very far away. Sarah heard them, processed them intellectually, understood their meaning, but her emotional processing system seemed to have stopped functioning. 3 years of hopping, of searching, of believing that Michael was alive somewhere, being held captive but alive, suddenly transformed into the crushing reality she'd been trying not to face. "I'm so sorry," Officer Richardson said, and Sarah heard genuine compassion in his voice. Sarah sat in silence for what felt like an eternity but was probably only minutes. Then slowly something shifted inside her. The grief was still there, it would always be there, but alongside it came something else. A grim determination, a fierce need to ensure that Michael's death meant something, that his suffering wasn't meaningless, that the people responsible were held accountable. "Tell me everything," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "Tell me what you found. Tell me what happened to my son." Over the next 2 hours, Detective Santos and Officer Richardson laid out the grim reality of what had happened to Michael. Robert Finch had indeed identified him as a target, had befriended him through a youth mentorship organization, and had convinced him to run away by promising him opportunities and freedom. Finch had used Ajax as leverage, ensuring Michael's compliance by threatening the dog. Michael had been held at various locations across 3 states, subjected to labor exploitation and sexual abuse. After approximately 14 months in captivity, Michael had died, the specific cause still being determined through forensic analysis, but preliminary indications suggested it was either from untreated illness or from injuries sustained during violent exploitation. The storage facility where he was found, Detective Santos explained, appears to have been used as a temporary holding location. We believe Michael may have been moved there after falling ill or becoming injured. Finch appears to have simply abandoned him there rather than seeking medical attention. Sarah felt something inside her break and reform simultaneously. Michael hadn't run away. Michael hadn't chosen this. Her 16-year-old son had been a victim of calculated predation by an adult he'd trusted, had been tortured and exploited, and had died alone in a storage facility while his mother searched desperately for him. "What about the others?" Sarah asked. "The other victims?" "We've identified 14 confirmed victims connected to this specific trafficking ring," Detective Santos said. 8 are deceased. 6 have been recovered alive. We're also identifying potential victims from other networks that intersected with Finch's operation. The investigation is ongoing and expanding. Over the following months, the investigation transformed from a missing persons case into one of the largest human trafficking prosecutions in the region's history. Robert Finch was charged with 17 counts of kidnapping, 15 counts of human trafficking, 12 counts of sexual exploitation of minors, and 8 counts of murder. Faced similar charges. 6 additional individuals involved in the trafficking network were arrested and charged. At the federal level, investigators began dismantling the upper echelons of the organization, identifying individuals who'd profited from the exploitation and trafficking of vulnerable teenagers. Federal prosecutors pursued aggressive sentences. In plea bargains and trial convictions, sentences ranged from 20 years to life imprisonment. The network that had operated with relative impunity for nearly a decade was systematically destroyed through the dedicated work of law enforcement agencies coordinating across state lines. Sarah attended every proceeding, sitting quietly in courtrooms as prosecutors presented evidence, as victims about their experiences, as defendants were sentenced. She never spoke publicly about Michael's case, respecting both the ongoing investigation and the privacy of other victims who'd survived. But her presence was a constant reminder to everyone involved, the prosecutors, the judges, the investigators, that behind every statistic, every case number, every criminal count was a human being, a teenager with dreams and potential whose life had been stolen. 6 months after Michael's remains were identified, a memorial service was held in his honor. Dozens of people attended, family members, school friends, teachers, investigators who'd worked on the case, and Sarah's sister, from whom she'd been estranged for years due to her obsessive search, but who'd reconnected after learning the truth. Officer Richardson brought Dutch to the memorial. Sarah knelt down to the dog's level, and the Belgian pressed his head gently against her chest. In that moment, the dog became something more than a police animal or a piece of evidence. He became a living connection to Michael, a survivor of the same predator, a living memory of a boy whose life had been cut short by human cruelty. "Thank you for keeping my son's memory alive," Sarah whispered to the dog, though she was speaking to something larger than just the animal, to the accident of circumstances that had brought Dutch into the police force, to Officer Richardson's willingness to listen to her wild theory, to her own relentless persistence despite years of dismissal and skepticism. Dutch remained with the police department, becoming something of a celebrity within law enforcement circles. His story, the dog who'd led investigators to solve a major trafficking case, was shared at training seminars, used to educate police officers about the importance of listening to families and pursuing seemingly unlikely leads. But more importantly, Dutch became a symbol of redemption, of the possibility that even in tragedy, connection and justice could emerge. Sarah found employment as an advocate with an organization dedicated to preventing human trafficking and supporting survivors. She used her experience, the painful knowledge of what predators looked for, how they operated, how they exploited vulnerabilities, to help other families navigate the criminal justice system and to educate teenagers about the dangers of online grooming and exploitation. She visited Dutch regularly at the police department, pressing her hand against his fur, whispering stories about Michael, about his dreams of becoming a lawyer, about his love of debate, about the way he'd trained Ajax with patience and kindness. In the dog's warm eyes, she found not forgiveness for the evil that had taken her son, but rather a kind of peace. Michael's death had ultimately led to the dismantling of a trafficking network, to the prosecution of predators, to the recovery of other victims, to the prevention of future exploitation. It wasn't justice in any traditional sense. No amount of criminal prosecution could bring Michael back. No number of convicted predators could undo the pain of his absence or the trauma of his death. But it was something. It was a mother's obsessive search transformed into systemic change. It was a boy's senseless death transformed into lives saved. It was a police dog whose origins had seemed random and insignificant, until a desperate mother had pointed at him on a Colorado highway and spoken 2 words that changed everything. Dutch continued his work as a K-9 officer, serving with distinction, becoming known as the dog who'd helped solve the trafficking case that changed law enforcement approaches across 5 states. And every month, Sarah visited him, bringing treats and memories, grateful for the strange alchemy of circumstance that had brought her and this dog together at exactly the moment when they both were needed to illuminate darkness and pursue truth. Michael was never coming home, but through his dog, through the investigation his disappearance had sparked, through the justice that had been served, he was finally being remembered. And that, Sarah learned, was perhaps the most powerful form of legacy, not the life that had been stolen, but the lives that had been saved through the truth of what had happened to him. Retry and make mistakes. Please double-check responses.